Welcome to the RedTech briefing. My guest today is Apurva Purohit, who until recently was president of Indian media titan, the Jagran Group. And prior to her role at the group level, she spent 16 years at Music Broadcast Limited, helping to grow the fledgling Radio City into one of India's most successful radio networks, listing it in 2017. She's one of India's most celebrated media CEOs, consistently featured on the list of the top 30 most powerful women in business by Fortune India in 2018, 2019, and 2020. And apart from her work in radio, she's a writer on women empowerment, and in December 2020 was fifth in Your Story's top 100 digital influencers of 2020. An incredibly storied career, and it's a pleasure to have you here with me on the RedTech briefing, Apurva. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me, Omar.
You're very welcome. You've spent 32 years in media. Yet, when I was reading up on your background, you have a degree in science with physics as your specialization, your major. What career were you intending to go towards or pursue, and when and why did that change?
So, Omar, remember, we are talking about 1989, right? 1987, 89, when I was doing my management and physics before that. And this is the pre-liberalization era. Yeah. And for middle class children such as us, the only way to sort of find a great job was either to become an engineer or to do your MBA or, education really, and education in marquee institutes was the way to get a good job. And therefore, physics just happened. I was looking for a good institute to study in, which happened to be Stella Maris in Chennai. Out of all the subjects, I would have liked to do math. But out of all the subjects that, wherever I could get admission, one took admission at that time. And so physics just happened. Having said that, I think doing a science degree, whether you're finally running the arts or in a creative field like radio, I think that sort of gives you a logical and structured mind. And I believe that that's really come to use because while I do enjoy the creativity of radio, I very much enjoy the business of creativity, the business of putting a structure around creativity. And I think one of the reasons we did well in Radio City is I sort of put a science even behind the music selection and the music playlists or what the RJ should say and not say.
Right, that's interesting. So you didn't just fall into radio, obviously. After you did the science degree, you went on to various other media opportunities. And then how did the radio opportunity arise?
Two things. Radio as a medium has always fascinated me. Again, my childhood, I remember, we had the government radio stations only in India at that time, but getting up at 6 o'clock and listening to some music or late night listening to some music, that sort of defined our childhood. So radio always was fascinating to me. The other reason I really got out of from television, moved to radio, was the fact that in 2005, when I joined Radio City, it had been taken over by a private equity fund, and they were looking for people to run it, and this sort of gave me a quasi-entrepreneurial window because private equity, they bring in the money, but the entire operations, the running, the strategy, the culture is all dependent on the CEO. And that sort of excited me because then Radio City became my baby.
Brilliant. So when you entered the corporate world, what was it like for women in India?
I mean, again, 1989, 1990, diversity wasn't even a word that anybody used at that time. Yeah, there was nothing like flexible timing, maternity leave, nothing of that kind. So all of us who wanted to work just put our heads down, and whatever came our way, we took it. We just entered the workforce behaving as yet another professional. And I think there are advantages to that because you don't expect any privileges, nor are you given any privileges. And therefore you end up fighting, in a sense, in a level playing field with the boys around. So At the same time, the disadvantage is that many women who could not cope or who did not have the support had to drop off. So,
Right.
so not having diversity as a theme or as an agenda led by organizations had its pitfalls and its opportunities.
But there was not a conscious effort to restrict your upward mobility. People, men, responding differently to you as a woman in a senior position. You didn't have. Was there that kind of prejudice at all?
I would say no, because I think media in that sense was a little more evolved, because I mean there were enough women in the industry. Of course, not at senior leadership level, but at middle and junior there were enough women. A lot of creative directors, whether it's in advertising or on television or in radio, happen to be women. And I think finally it's how you approach it, right, Omar? So I never thought of myself as a woman CEO or a woman director. I was just a professional. And I think if you approach it in that manner, 99% of the time, people also look at you like that.
That's good advice, I think, for women in entering the workplace right now, is not to see themselves as different, but to see themselves as professional and carving out a career. Gender becomes, not something that you put in front of everybody as you enter that place. It's your professionalism, and of course, people on merit will see your capabilities. When you reflect on that trajectory, what qualities do you think in particular led to your appointment as CEO of Radio City? When you went for that interview, or when you went through that process with whomever you needed to, what were the things that stood out, you think, for the people that were interviewing you?
Omar, I say this with great pride. When people ask me, what are you most happy about, or what do you feel good about, what do you feel fulfilled about? I think the one thing I keep on telling people, especially youngsters, is that in 32 years of working, what I feel most proud about is I never made a CV. All my jobs, all the changes that happened in my life, everywhere it was because of somebody referring me, somebody having worked with me in the past. And therefore, I say that instead of building CVs, I think we should spend a lot more time building our reputations, because actually our reputations are what define us. CV, ultimately, you'll write on a piece of paper. You look for a job, you look for a designation change because it looks good on your CV. But people don't really consider that. It's really what people are saying about you, what people are talking about you, when they interact with you. We may end up meeting people only once, twice. We may end up meeting senior people, junior people in conferences, at work, as colleagues. What is the reputation we are building? And are we mindful of that reputation building? Even when I'm talking to you today, you have prepared, I have prepared for this. Many people would have said, I have done these interviews, I practically do them every day, I don't need to, I'll just go and read out something. But you haven't. You've thought about it, you've studied what you want to ask me. That's reputation building, right? And the reality is not many people do this. And therefore, I think what got me all my all the, whether it was the CEO position or the president position, has all been on the reputation that has been built over 32 years of every moment doing the best you can at your job.
But in those early days, what do you think somebody who refereed you, what do you think they said about you? I know this is difficult, humility is important to everyone, but there must have been some specific things. And this was early on in your career, relatively early. You're talking about 32 years now. You've built up this incredible reputation, and you have this, all of these awards to show for it because people recognize those qualities. But early on, somebody said what when they said Apurva?
I think the 2-3 things they would have possibly said is that I'm very committed, very high integrity, very high on always on accountability, and that's one virtue I really respect. And I believe that whether within an organization, within myself, within my teams, accountability. So you take ownership. So nobody has to motivate you, or today we are, all of us as leaders, as managers, are constantly trying to motivate our teams. But I say, why do you need to? If you are driven, if you take accountability for your actions, you may be an executive, a trainee, a manager. So accountability, they would say that she takes accountability. You don't need to, she's not a high maintenance employee.
Right. So when you, again, now let's go back to 30 years to reflect on, over 30 years in media, and not just radio, but let's focus specifically on radio. How is the challenge for a radio CEO today, coming in new, as someone who's promoted, very different than it was, say, 10 years ago?
So I think the challenges for radio as a medium have only increased in this last decade, right? And the reasons are pretty obvious. It's really the onslaught, if we can say, of digital, and the mindset that is operating, where digital is seen as a enemy, as a competitor, and not as an associate. Equally, I think what's happening is, because of this whole perception around digital, a lot of advertisers, a lot of people who work within the media industry are feeling, if digital has come, radio, print, all the traditional media will die. So I think there's a lot of combating one has to do with this perception that digital is the enemy. And we'll talk a little more about the fact that I personally don't believe. I think it's a complementary medium. But I think the perception that the current CEOs have to fight against, the digital, the new medium, digital, the onslaught of digital media, is one big challenge that a radio CEO would be facing. The other big challenge a radio CEO will face, especially in India, is that, when 2005, 2006, when the government deregulated the medium, there was the expectation that different phases would come out. Phase 1 would open it out in 20 markets, phase 2 in 50, so on and so forth. And then one day it would reach the entire country. The fact is that even after almost 15, 16 years of the deregulation happening, the medium is still available only in 30% of the country from a population reach perspective. So it's not lived up to the potential because the government has not opened it out. So I think these are the two critical challenges a new CEO would face.
So let's hone in on some of those challenges, and importantly, how you dealt with them, because you lived through that change, when it was, when radio was a fairly dominant medium, when digital was still in its infancy, certainly in India, even in other parts of the world, still growing. You had to transition Radio City. Even in your group job, you were managing strategy and vision and mentoring leadership in the organization. How do you think CEOs today need to respond to those challenges that are of even greater scale, of even greater criticality? The issue of data analytics, the issue of technology and how it's changing the world. Let me hear what your thoughts are about how you would respond, or how you advise others to respond.
So as I said, there are two challenges. One is this whole perception around radio, right? And the other is this the fact that digital is seen as the big glamorous new medium in the entire pie of advertising. I think the way I approached it, and I recommend that all CEOs in radio approach it, is to first of all question, what is radio? What is radio all about? Ultimately, I think we have to understand, are we content creators? Are we content distributors? Are we aggregators of consumers who, and then go to an advertiser and say that I've got these many consumers, what are you willing to pay for that, right? And I think the answer there is that let us not overemphasize on the fact of the distribution pipeline. I think when we think of radio, we see it as FM, terrestrial FM. It will go through the tower, it will go into people's houses, and then we start questioning how many people are listening, how many people have an FM a receiver in their place, etc., etc. Whereas the reality is that think about yourself as the content creator who is then aggregating consumers. The moment you think of yourself as a content creator, then it doesn't matter which pipeline you reach out to the consumers to, right? So I can be a content creator and reach out to you through an FM device. I can be a content creator and reach out to you the podcast that you're listening on to your phone. I can be a content creator and you can listen to me via web radio. So the moment you disengage from the distribution pipeline, then immediately digital actually becomes an opportunity and not a threat. Because digital is ensuring that your content now reaches out to millions of people who would not be listening to you via the FM receiver. So the moment you start thinking of digital like that, it immediately becomes something that you can use as a strength rather than fight against. And I feel one of the biggest challenges that all of us who've been running traditional media companies, whether it's print or radio, has been that our content creators have not understood this. Our programming directors, our editors have always, oh my God, I don't want to do anything in digital. Oh my God, I understand only the studio. But you have to understand digital. You have to use it. And therefore, the effort that I took in the last 5 years, I would say, in training teams to accept digital. And the fight was not against digital. The fight was against the mindset of our own teams. I think that's so I actually put in a whole thing in place. What is the DQ of our organization, the digital quotient? And that can only come when you understand. I started doing this 5 years ago. So that when digital happened in scale, they would be very much able to utilize its strengths. And that's what's happening with Radio City. Even now, our programming directors have become digital experts too, which wouldn't have happened if they hadn't gone through the training. I think the second thing about perception. So our consumers, for example, love radio. If you go and do any consumer research, they will say we listen to radio, we find the RJs friendly, they are our companions. We believe the credibility of RJs has actually gone up in the last few years. The same research, if you do with an advertiser, Omar, they will tell you a completely different picture. No, nobody listens to radio. So how do you evangelize radio to advertisers? Because your money is coming from there. And I think as a CEO, you have to be a radio evangelizer more than anything else.
And do advertisers start to take that seriously? I mean, what you're saying about the romance with digital among the advertising industry, and increasingly the skill set among the people that you talk to in advertising is they're all digital natives now. And radio is seen as yesterday's hero. What have you had success with that evangelization? Can you, whether it's with Radio City or you saw it with, with one of your peer group, have you seen in India people being able to convince those digital natives that there is a place for radio, that it has value, that there is perhaps a case study that shows the power of the medium to deliver?
It's not easy because, as you rightly said, the people you're talking to, the media buyer, the media planner on the other side of the equation is a digital native. He says, I don't consume radio. I just consume social media. So let me put all my advertising budget there. So it's not easy. However, it can be done. And it can be done in two ways. One is we have to understand that we have to have facts to prove our case. It cannot be my opinion and your opinion because we know that we cannot change each other's opinions, right? But if I have fact-based information, and for fact-based information, you require a lot of measurement. Now, I've been a big believer always, maybe because of my own 12 years as a media planner. I believe in measurement. And unfortunately, that's where I would say many industries have failed, including our own industry, that we've not been able to come together and put in significant money or convince advertisers to put in significant money behind measurement. So if we have accurate measurement, if you have measurement at scale, if you're able to prove we know the facts, we know when we go and talk to our listeners, how many of them are listening. But if the industry could have done it at scale together, I think the story would have been a little different. But I also understand the challenges different CEOs face of not never having enough money, never having enough resources, right? So I think that's the measurement. The other thing is, when you don't have measurement, what do you do? So then it is all about, as you said, the case studies. Are you able to prove? And therefore, are we able to develop? And in fact, at Radio City, what we've been doing is, with different categories, we've been trying to work on different types of case studies where you just use radio, case study where you use radio in conjunction with print, case studies where you use radio and digital together, case studies where you use the influencers of radio on digital and the difference it has made to clients. And I think that's the one that's showing a lot of traction.
So is there a high level of sophistication in terms of India when it comes to digital consumption, digital measurement? Is it on par with other markets around the world? Is that the threat that radio is facing? Same level of accountability of that medium? Because that's one of the things that I guess advertisers always say, well, I can see what's happening. I can count the clicks, so I can see how many people are interacting. And that seems to be like, one of the issues that radio faces.
Absolutely. I think one of the biggest strengths that digital is being able to sort of serve to the advertisers to prove, right? And unfortunately, and that's exactly what we were discussing a few moments ago, radio's never been able to prove that point, right? So in India specifically, yes, of course, digital penetration is, we know the numbers, we know the number of mobile penetration in the country, the way digital is growing at 30, 40, 50%. So at the one hand, there is this huge digital expansion taking place. However, also we must understand, and I think many of us do, that India is a very complex country, right? So there are different versions of India. The India in metros is very different from the India in mini metros, is very different from the India in rural terms. The Indians at a particular socioeconomic category and Indians a little lower down the chain have very different. I mean, we were just talking about, if you read the reports today of online education in the pandemic, less than 1% of children have been able to use online to successfully be taught. And what are the reasons? The reasons are really while the penetration, I may have a phone, I may have a cheap phone, but I don't have the bandwidth. I don't have the electricity to charge my phone. I don't have so I think those are the challenges. 200 kilometers out of Bombay, your calls will constantly keep dropping. So what are we talking about? Entire education happening online, right? So I think we will overcome those challenges. But today, penetration is there, but is that penetration and reach converting into actual usage is a infrastructural issue.
Right. Which I thought, when I hear you say that, it's sort of the same in certain other developing markets. The infrastructure is in some way given radio another lease on life. It's given you more longevity because with an FM network, for example, you're not using bandwidth. It's absolutely free. It's consistent. The quality is there. And that's, at one stage, many of us thought that would, sort of help us. The worse the broadband infrastructure is in a developing market, the better for a medium like radio. And now with the conversion happening, like you say, more and more people, there's no question that as the infrastructure improves, the migration just follows in droves. So when we talk about radio taking on that digital challenge, does it not scare you, and maybe that's a wrong way to phrase this, that your big competitors, the Googles, the Facebooks, the others, maybe those are not the best, the most important ones in India, and I'd like you to tell me that. They have such a scale, and therefore they're able to price in a particular way for that scale at literally cents or rupees, cents in the rupees, rather than what we have to price at as radio. Does that not intimidate and scare you?
So Omar, firstly, you were right in saying that maybe I didn't use the right words, scare and intimidate, because I don't get scared and intimidated.
Yeah, those are my words, and I think those are the wrong words to use with you. And I'm glad to hear that you don't get scared and intimidated.
But the way I would answer this question is yes. Google, Facebook, etc., are similar challenges everywhere. The kind of scale they have, the kind of deep pockets they have, the way that they want to just take over everything in advertising, I think it's similar across the world, right? However, I think there are two things that I would tell all radio CEOs or all traditional media CEOs. One is that after all, whether it's Google or whether it's Facebook, they all need content, which harks back to the first point I made, that what are you? Google can be your distribution pipeline, no? If you have great content, if you're doing great podcasts, Spotify can be your distribution pipeline, right? So how are you defining yourself? Are you defining yourself as high quality audio content creators? Then everybody will come to you because people need content. Facebook is not developing its own content, it's using somebody else's content, right? So I think that's where we have to really focus on creating high barriers to entry or huge moats around our quality content, which is a mix of our RJs and our original audio content, etc. I think that's one thing. The second thing is, and again, research is proving this out repeatedly, is that there's nothing like a digital consumer and a non-digital consumer. There's nothing like a person who shops in a brick and mortar retail outlet and a person who shops online. Increasingly, research is saying that the consumer is a hybrid animal. So we see Amazon wanting to create offline stores, right? We see offline retail chains wanting to go online. So both will coexist, both have to coexist because that's how consumers are. I mean, I do online, but I may go and my footwear, I may want to go offline to buy. I may browse something online, but finally, if I want to try an outfit, I will go offline. So I think that's what we have to understand. The consumer is going to be always hybrid, and a media consumer was always hybrid, will be hybrid. I mean, when I joined advertising, people said, "Oh, print will die off, television," because that time television was the big daddy. But did that happen? It didn't happen, right? Print is coexisting after 30 years. Print is coexisting, television is coexisting, radio is there, digital is there, because the consumer wants it like that. So I feel
that's unique to India as well, hey, that print continues to flourish, while in other markets, for example, the US and others, it really is a much smaller medium than it was 10, 15 years ago. So that's quite unique to your market at the moment.
Yes, it's unique, but at the same time, I would not say that print is a smaller share in the US, because again, the New York Times, Financial Times, they've just
those that transitioned have done it relatively successfully.
To the iPad, right? So again, because they define themselves as news providers, not newspaper providers.
Yes, you're right. Absolutely. That's very great advice and information and wisdom, and thank you for that. And now I want to ask you to look in a crystal ball. It's always the most difficult thing to do, but paint this picture of radio in India first, and then your view of what happens to radio in the rest of the world 10 years from today, with increasing broadband penetration, particularly in India, maybe even 100%, and good speeds and lower costs. And therefore, anyone, I know you've got the stratification of society economically, but even those who are poor are provided with some sort of capability to go online. What does radio look like in India 10 years from now? And then your global picture of the medium.
So I would say this, that, it really depends on how the current CEOs of radio think about their organizations, their businesses, their brands. Because if people start thinking of radio and wanting to compete at a national arena, let me make it a national, let me maximize my reach and try to cover the whole country and then compete with the others for the cheapest cost per thousand, radio will die. Mm-hmm. However, if they look at it differently, Omar, if they look at it from the perspective that let me figure out, and that's what we do when we create brands, right? We look for that niche, we look for that USP, we look for that differentiator. And to me, the differentiator for radio in the next 10 years, in the next 20 years is going to be how local and localized it can get. So if I run Radio City as 40 radio stations, each one catering to a city, a suburb, a region, and not Radio City, the national FM player. There is a niche there because nobody will be interested in local coverage. Print is not interested in local coverage. TV certainly can't do it because they, by the technology, are national, right? Digital again is looking at segments, but then they're looking at segments which cut across geographies. Geographic specificity is a unique position that radio can occupy. And if that's what radio operators chase, whether in India, whether internationally, because again, wearing my media planning hat, I will want national audiences. But today, what are we seeing? We are seeing especially around pandemic, we are seeing a growth of many local advertisers, many local regional players, whether in FMCG, whether in durables, who are building their markets in smaller pockets. MSMEs in India, for example. So they need advertising. They can't go to television. They need an advertising medium which caters to their local needs. And I think that's where radio can play a wonderful part. But as I keep on telling people that, another word for focus is sacrifice. So you have to learn to sacrifice something if you want to focus. But ultimately, it's focus that will win you the battle.
And that's at the heart of good strategy. Trade-offs all the time, making choices, and it's the most difficult thing at all that anyone can have in business is to make those choices. Apurva Purohit, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a real pleasure having you on RedTech Briefing, listening to your wisdom, giving us all insights into not just radio in India, but the medium in general, and importantly, right at the beginning, your career, your growth trajectory. It's been a real honor and a privilege to have this time with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Omar. Thank you for inviting me.